Hey, everybody, this is Pete Bartolozzi welcoming you to another broadcast. And as you can see by the upper corner, I'm continuing this. This is Daniel and Revelation. This is only the second broadcast, so we haven't gotten very far at this point. We spent most of the first broadcast I laid some foundational information and then primarily focused on the very first word or the very first verse, the phrase about the great sea, saying that this is not just a superfluous opening statement just to begin things, but it was literally getting right to the heart of things. And the very first thing that God had to reveal to Daniel, and it had things to do with the winds that blew upon the great sea. And the great sea literally laid the background for all end time biblical prophecy. This is the backdrop, if you would, of all end time biblical prophecy. The Great Sea. And again, the Great Sea is the Mediterranean Sea. So this has to do end time biblical prophecy. All of it, beginning with Daniel. So that means all of it is the background of the Mediterranean Sea. It is that all that area around the Mediterranean Sea, the European, Middle Eastern, North African area of the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, the real focus of this is Israel in these prophecies, which, of course, Israel lies on the Mediterranean Sea, or the Great Sea, as they called it back then again. So I want to continue now. And again, remember that I'm going to be looking at the vision of chapter 7 and the vision of chapter 8 simultaneously because they correspond with each other. And also as it compares to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, as they also correspond with each other. And so I'll let you know where I'm at so you can follow along. So just have it, your a bookmark in Daniel chapter 2 where the Nebuchadnezzar vision is, and in chapter 8 where the second vision is as well. But we're continuing in chapter 7. And now that the background has all been laid about the Mediterranean Sea, we're going to look at verse 4. Were the first beasts that rise up out of the sea. Now, of course, these winds that are blowing upon the great sea obviously are not just referring to natural winds, because natural winds don't cause great beasts to rise up out of the sea. So these are spiritual winds. And these great beasts are kingdoms that rule over Israel. They're not necessarily, God endeavors to have as much influence in them as he possibly can, but much of them are influenced by Satan, as we will see. So these winds are not referring to divine winds as they are referring to demonic winds. As we know in the New Testament, Jesus referred to Satan as the prince of the power of the air. That literally means of this atmosphere, of the winds. And so this is talking about spiritual influences, not just natural winds. And so when the winds blew and these beasts rose up, the first beast that's listed now is verse 4, and it says, "And the first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings, and I was watching as its wings, which lifted it up from the earth, were plucked, and it stood upon 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it." What God revealed to King Nebuchadnezzar as a metallic colossus, a statue, made up of 4 kingdoms, he now reveals to Daniel as bestial kingdoms. Daniel was in his late teens when he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He is about 85 years old now that his visions begin, or the visions God gives him begin. In Nebuchadnezzar's dream, in Daniel 2:31, it describes the statue as being immense. This word for immense is the Hebrew rab, which means huge. The Strong's defines it as huge in size, domineering in character, very great. And it's basically double the Hebrew word rab, which is the word that means figuratively of power, influence, and so on. And here it says rab. So it's just emphasizing how great and how immense. It's kind of like when somebody who's very tall and very powerful and has strong character can seem intimidating when they stand over you. Well, that's kind of what this is describing of this statue. It's immense. It's huge. It's like, whoa. And it just seems very overwhelming. And thus it emphasizes it with this word rab twice. Rab, creating that phrase. My Tanakh, and I will refer to this at times. The Tanakh is simply what the Jews referred to as what we call the Old Testament scriptures. It's just a Hebrew acronym. The T stands for the Torah, which is the first 5 books, and then you have the end is the Ne'evim, and it refers to the prophets. And then you have the CH, or really pronounced like a K, the Ketuvim, which represents the writings. And so and they put a couple vowels in there and pronounce it Tanakh. It's just a Hebrew acronym for what they refer to, what we call Old Testament scriptures. But in there's some footnotes in the Stone edition of the Tanakh that I use. And it says, the lion represents the great power of the Babylonian Empire. The high-flying eagle's wings symbolizes its arrogance. This corresponds to chapter 2 in the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, verse 36 through 38. And it says, this was the dream. Now we will reveal the interpretation before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for God, the God of heaven, has given you a strong kingdom, royal power, and honor. Now, really, I want you to see here, this is where that phrase King of Kings is developed. It's during this Babylonian era. You see, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered other kingdoms, he would place a king to continue to rule in those areas of the kingdom, but those kings were subject to him, and thus the phrase, he is a king of kings. And this was developed out of that time. So when Jesus, needless to say, comes in, there's none higher than him. So he says, I am the King of Kings. And so that's what he is called, the King of Kings, and of course, the Lord of Lords as well. There is none higher than him. All in the end, all will be subject to him, as we'll see, as we saw through Nebuchadnezzar's life in the first part of this book that we really didn't get into, but you know the stories. But chapter 2, so this is where this comes from. He said, I am that king of, but anyway, he said, you are a king of kings, for God has given you, God of heaven has given you a strong kingdom, royal power, and honor. And then verse 38 says, and wherever the children of men, the animals of the field, and the birds of the heaven dwell, he has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. So even though the head of gold represents the kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar being the king that was its greatest king, its longest standing king. He brought, even though his father began the Babylonian Empire and were conquering other nations, and he ruled contemporaneously with his father. His father was the high king during that time, but he conquered. But under Nebuchadnezzar, even though some conquering still took place, it came to its greatness in power and in glory under Nebuchadnezzar. And so he reigned the longest of all the kings of Babylon. So that's why even though the head represents the kingdom of Babylon, it has the image of Nebuchadnezzar, who was its greatest king. And so now it says, giving great honor. Verse 38, we've read that. But I want you to notice, it says, he has made you ruler over them all, the children of men, the animals of the field, the birds of heaven. He has given them into your hand, has made you ruler over them all. Again, clearly telling us that the parts of the statue represent kingdoms, and in this case, even the leader that's over them. I want to bring out some things that's interesting, that it says that God has made you ruler over all the children of men, and over all the animals and the beasts and the fowls of the air. He's made you ruler over them all. Well, did the Babylonian kingdom rule the entire globe of the earth so that he was over all the children of men, as we would view it in our Western culture? No, not as we would view it. So we got to understand again how God uses, how they viewed, and therefore God spoke to them in terms that they viewed concerning what the whole earth, all the children of men, how it was used in their day. You see, because he was in that area of the world, the Eurasian, African area. He was the strongest king of the time. It had influence, even though he didn't control all that area. The strength of his kingdom had influence in all those areas. He was considered to rule the world, the whole world, and here over all the children of men, per se, from their perspective. And therefore, their perspective, God is speaking to them, and thus this perspective gets incorporated into end-time biblical prophecy. We need to see that. Again, we got to stop trying to interpret the Bible, but especially as end-time prophecies, in light of our Western way of thinking. When you do that, we will violate, we will do great injustice in interpreting the Word of God every single time. So let's begin. So let's see that. Their archaeological evidence brings out the fact that Babylon saw themselves as a lion with eagle's wings. The Ishtar gates, which was the main entrance into Babylon, had these long corridor up to the Ishtar gates. They brought their conquered enemies through there, and it was a big display of this long wall up to the Ishtar gates. And as they unearthed these from Babylon, it shows all along the wall paintings of lions with eagle's wings. Now, there were others. There was the Babylonian dragon that was depicted as well. But one of the main things that was predicted all along this wall was lion with eagle's wings through this main entrance. And these gates are in a museum in Germany. Daniel knew this. From the very moment he saw this beast rise up out of the Mediterranean, this lion with eagle's wings, he knew what it represented. Because he was in Babylon all this time. He was a high official in Babylon, often directly under the king himself. He was a high official. He knew that Babylon saw themselves as a lion with eagle's wings. And so God uses what they saw themselves as to represent them in biblical prophecy. That's a key point to take note to, because when I get into the book of Revelation, I'm going to bring that up again so we can help understand what beast what they say beast, and I'll probably continue to use the word beast, but it's just simply the word for animals. But in some ways, I'll call them beasts because it talks about how ferocious they are. It's usually a conglomeration, not just one single animal, but usually a conglomeration like a lion with eagle's wings. Well, there's no such thing as a lion with eagle's wings in the natural. So it's a conglomeration of a lion with the wings of an eagle. And so we'll see this throughout biblical prophecy. So I'll continue to call him beast, but it basically means an animal in its reference. And so let's see. Let's make sure I'm staying on course here with what I was. These beasts rise up. And so he knew, is what my point was, is Daniel knew what the lion with eagle's wings was. God didn't have to interpret that for him. He knew. And And since this first beast represents the same kingdom as the first part of the statue, it is clear that he revealed to Daniel the exact same kingdoms, but as was revealed in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where his was metallic statue, his was beast, but it's the exact same kingdoms. But needless to say, in these visions, much, much more detail is revealed of them. The beast in Daniel's vision then corresponds with the metallic statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Okay, so at this point of the vision, it's really not prophetic in the sense of revealing the future, because it's starting with where Daniel is at. The Babylonian Empire is existing. It's not something that is yet to be in his future. It already is. So this vision starts with that and builds from there to show the future. This is very common in end time biblical prophecy, where God will connect, show the past and how it connects with the present in order to show the future. So it's not uncommon to see that in biblical prophecy as we are now. In verse 5 now of chapter 7 of Daniel, it says, "Then behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear, and it raised itself up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, Arise, devour much flesh," or a large quantity of flesh. This second kingdom, now it was prophetic in Daniel's time. This is where the prophetic part, the future, prophesying of the future, comes into play in Daniel's vision. Because even though the Medo-Persian Empire was already in existence in his day, or at least the different kingdom, the Median Empire, the Persian Empire, were in existence in his day. What was going to transpire in the future, he didn't know. So this is where prophetic future events begin to take place. But he already knew that they existed, and it says so. And we know. But for us, this is history. The Medo-Persian Empire is what came up after the Babylonian Empire. It was what conquered the Babylonian Empire and became the next kingdom. And but here in this vision, the first vision, it represents the Medo-Persian Empire as a bear that rose up on one side. Now, the bear rising up on one side refers to the Persian over the Median Empire when they became one. The Forerunner commentary states this: Cyrus, a Persian, initiated the growth of the empire by usurping the Median throne with the help of Median nobility. The empire from this point on was dominated by Persians. The Tanakh states this and bears in its commentary: the bear represents the Persian Empire. Of course, this is past for us, so we already know that. Powerful and corpulent, which means stout, bulky, fat, but not speedy. It lacked the eagle's wings and the regal power of the lion. And needless to say, and the Medo-Persian Empire is primarily in what we call present-day Iran. I've drawn a map up here. Hopefully, it's understandable. It's not perfect in its drawing, needless to say, because I drew it by hand. But hopefully, the Mediterranean Sea and the European, Middle Eastern, North African area is at least generally seen here. And of course, it's over in this area that we know that Iraq is, and that was generally where the Medo-Persian Empire was, at least the heart of it in that day. Of course, it expanded when it conquered, but the heart of it was that area of Iraq today. This corresponds with chapter 2, verse 39 in the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And it just simply says this, just the first part of the verse. And all it says about this is, after you will arise another kingdom inferior to yours. And this, of course, according to verse 32, is after the gold head is the chest and arms of silver. And this represents the Medo-Persian Empire. The Faith in Action commentary concerning the bear. It's a commentary put out by some gentlemen who are of the Assemblies of God. And it says, the bear had 3 ribs in its mouth. The ribs represent the 3 major kingdoms that the Medo-Persian Empire conquered. They conquered Lydia in 546 BC, Babylon in 539 BC, and Egypt in 525 BC. This corresponds now with the second vision that Daniel had in chapter 8 in the first 4 verses. And it says in verse 1, in the 3rd year of the king of Babylon, King Belshazzar, let me say that again. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at first. And of course, we've already looked at this verse, because when it says after that which appeared to me at first, it's saying that it corresponds with this first vision. So this is what this wording means. It's not merely a statement of saying, well, this one happened after the first one. That's obvious, because one's happened in the 1st year of Belshazzar, and the next one happened in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. So you don't have to make any more statement other than that when it comes to which one came first and which one came second. But that statement actually means it is after, it is in correspondence with, it's to the first vision. Now, there's a lot of question about Belshazzar, and I don't want to spend a lot of time here because, archaeological history that we have found is Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon and was defeated by Cyrus of Persia. So people have questioned the Bible and saying that, well, see, the Bible's wrong and all this kind of stuff. But there's a cuneiform, which is how they kept records back then. A cuneiform is just a large clay cylinder in which they impressed their language in it to record things, and then it would dry in the sun so it would be hardened. And this cuneiform is in a British museum, and it clearly tells that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon. And it refers to them, and it shows how the two of them reigned contemporaneously. You see, Nebuchadnezzar, before him was his father, the high king of Babylon, but he reigned as king in Babylon also contemporaneously with his father, even though his father was high king until his father died, and then he became the high king and the king of kings, as it said. And this was true concerning Belshazzar as well. Nabonidus was not very popular because of some things he did with the Babylonians. And so he left Babylon and went to the western side of the kingdom and was looking at possibly bringing Arabia into their kingdom and conquering there, and left his son as king in the city of Babylon, in the province of Babylon, still under his father. So that would have technically made him second ruler, but he was essentially, just like the rest of the Babylon, like Nebuchadnezzar, he still left kings in position over these territories he conquered, but they were subject to him, and thus again he was king of kings. So Belshazzar just reigned contemporaneously with his father and was the acting king in Babylon. So those who try to undermine this story of Daniel and say it's not true because Nabonidus was, that's not true. In fact, it was. But when Cyrus began to come against Babylon, Nabonidus came with his armies, but he was defeated by Cyrus. Now, it doesn't say for sure whether Nabonidus was killed or were in seeing his armies being destroyed and that Nabonidus fled, but either way, he was defeated by Cyrus. And so with Belshazzar, king of Babylon, that left him as king that was left since Nabonidus fled or had died. And but it was interesting that but still his father, I still think that his father was still alive because he was still only second ruler, because when Daniel interpreted the handwriting on the wall, or when that came, he actually told the magicians, whoever can interpret this, I'll give him great riches and great honor and make him third ruler of the kingdom. Well, the only reason he can make Daniel another person third ruler in the kingdom is because he was only second ruler. Third ruler was the highest position he could offer. And so he made Daniel the third ruler when God made him. He didn't want it, but God had a purpose in it. So, with Nabonidus either dead or fled, and then, of course, Belshazzar was killed that night, as it says in Scripture. Then when Cyrus the Persian came in and took Babylon the next day, who was in authority to meet him? It was Daniel. Daniel was raised back up into high position just before Cyrus came in, and they must have already knew each other, because again, Daniel was great high position under Nebuchadnezzar, and had been to these other kingdoms, including, and we'll see that as we go on, and so they knew who Daniel was, because he represented the king of Babylon in these other countries, including the Medo-Persian Empire. All right. I'm spending a lot of time on that. I didn't want to spend a lot of time explaining that, but I wanted to go on. Now I'm trying to look here as to where I left off. Okay. In verse 2 now, chapter 8, we're looking at the vision given to him in chapter 8. And it says, "In the vision I watched and saw that I was at the citadel in Susa, which is the province of Elam. And in this vision I was by the Ulai River." Now notice, Daniel knew what these things were when he was in his vision. See, again, as I've already brought out, kind of got ahead of myself, but he obviously knew what Susa looked like. He obviously knew this Ulai River. He knew what these things were. He was there in Susa as a representation of the king of Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon. And so he knew these things. He knew what these were. He had been to these places, being such a high official. And in fact, they say the Jewish commentary states that the reason when this big statue was made and it was only Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who were thrown in the fiery furnace, like where was Daniel? And they said that Daniel was away on king's business when all this took place. That's why Daniel's not mentioned there. So he was common for him to be sent out of country to represent the kingdom, being in such a high position to represent the king. So anyway, the citadel Susa it was the capital of the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, is also known as Shushan. And then it says the Ulai River. The Ulai is actually not known as a river. You got to understand that any kind of river, stream, it uses the same word in the Hebrew. And he says, but he said, what we do know is there was a canal made off a river to supply the city of Susa with water. The canal is believed to be this Ulai River. So some translate this actually as the Ulai Canal, and my Tanakh translates it as, my stone edition of the Tanakh, as the Ulai Stream. It was a man-made river, canal, stream or whatever that supplied the city of Susa with water off another river. And so that's what this is. And in verse 3, "I lifted up my eyes to observe, and behold, a ram with 2 horns stood before the river, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. Of course, this represents, again, like the bear rising up on one side, it was the Persian over the Median Empire. Even though they became one, Cyrus had successfully, without war, had taken or usurped the Median throne and brought them into one kingdom. So one horn was bigger than the other. It's again, the Persian over the Median Empire becoming one kingdom. And then in verse 4, it says that I saw the ram thrust westward, northward, southward, and no beast could stand before it, nor could anyone rescue out of its hand. It did as it pleased and became very great. And rescue out of its hand. Hand is figuratively used in the Hebrew in reference to power, authority, and greatness. Now, there's something very interesting in this description here that really helps. It's going to be important for us to understand biblical prophecy because this is used more than once. And it helps us when we get to the book of Revelation to understand the Antichrist kingdom and where it's actually located. Because these directions actually tell us where they started. Notice the direction of the ram. It says the direction, it goes westward, northward, and southward. So now I'm going to go over here. I may have to go over here and take a look at it so you can see the map. I've written over here, Middle Persian area. This is the area primarily of today's Iraq. And it tells you, it doesn't say it moves westward, or excuse me, it doesn't say it moves eastward. They never went towards today's Pakistan, India, China, any of those areas. They went westward, southward, and northward. Okay? By the very direction of where they go, it helps us to pinpoint where they're located. Now, I know this right now sounds unnecessary to talk about because we understand where the Persian Empire was and which direction they conquered. But we need to understand this direction thing. It helps us to understand where things start. This is going to be important when we get into the book of Revelation, so that's why I'm emphasizing it here. But that's just something to take note of, stick on a shelf, and we'll take it off the shelf again when we get to the book of Revelation to help understanding these things. Now, in the vision in Revelation, what time is it? Oh, I'm pretty much out of time, folks. So we're at this point. But in the vision and I said Revelation in Daniel chapter 8, in the latter part of the chapter, Daniel actually gets the interpretation of the vision, because when you jump down, when you look at verse 15 now, it says, "And it came to pass when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, behold, there stood before me what appeared to be a man, and I heard a man's voice in the middle of the Uli. He called out, saying, Gabriel, make him to understand the vision." And so Gabriel comes standing near. In verse 17, it said, the angel came where I was standing, or he said he came near to where I was standing, and when he had come, I was overwhelmed, and so on. And we'll look at this further, but he now begins to receive the interpretation of the vision of the first part, or in the first part of this chapter. And so he goes into a lot of detail. Daniel doesn't get much interpretation of this in this first vision in chapter 7, except concerning that final beast, where Daniel asked, that beast terrified him, and he said, "What is this beast?" And he did get some interpretation concerning that. Well, my time is gone, and I'll have to take up from here. So I trust that I know this is just basic right now, but as we continue to go on, we start getting into the future part that has yet to be fulfilled, that is still future to us as well, concerning the Antichrist kingdom and so on. So, of course, when I mean so on, I mean going into the millennial reign is all a part of these prophecies as well. But I trust this is helping to make things very simple and very basic, and we will continue with this later in the next, who knows, however many episodes it's going to take to get all this teaching out. And it's going to take quite a few, I'm sure. So I just once again wants to thank you for listening in, and be blessed.